I think IRAS is especially delighted to be able to welcome our speaker today. Dr. David Brin is known for the work that he's done in many different areas. He's been involved in writing novels. He wrote The Postman, which became a film. He's done explorations of the near future in Earth and existence. The Transparent Society gave him the American Library Association's Freedom of Speech Award for work that he's done on security, secrecy, and privacy concerns. He's a scientist, a tech consultant. He's even done things with astronomy, space exploration, SETI, and nanotechnology. He was appraised as the #1 influencer in a top 100 report on artificial intelligence influencers. Today, Dr. Brin is going to talk to us about imagination and prediction in the age of science. David, I'm going to turn it over to you, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Gail. And Maynard, thank you for organizing this. I won't be able to attend the Star Island conference, but Maynard talked me into working on something that I think some of you who attend may consider to either be a treat or, well, you can always walk out of the room. We recorded 3 sort of mini talks. They're about 20 minutes each, in which I sort of present a guided tour of my impressions of the science fiction, mostly films, a few books that are easily rentable, that provoke at least thoughts having to do with ethics, and some of them, a fair number of them, having to do with religion in the age of science. And these would be under different topics, such as cloning, or our relationships with other creatures here on Earth. What might be our relationships with the new children we're making as we speak in artificial intelligence, or aliens, other types of beings that we might encounter, or our children might encounter across this galaxy. The plan is, and it's up to Maynard to look into executing it, to show a few video clips, and then each evening would have a selected film to watch for those who have nothing better to do on Star Island in the evening. Someday I hope to attend one of the IRAS events. If for no other reason, then I have a theological play that was just premiered at my alma mater, Caltech, some months ago. It's in that famous genre, subgenre, smart Alec confronts the devil. We've all seen those. There are references to the devil and Daniel Webster, and of course the wonderful musical from the 1950s called Damn Yankees, which is effectively about that, a fellow's Faustian pursuit of being a baseball player in his late 50s. The devil makes a deal that he later regrets. So that's the plan, and I've recorded those elements, those 3 mini talks for Star Island, and I imagine they'll be available as recordings after the event. Now, all of that is based upon or extracted from my most recent nonfiction book, which is called Vivid Tomorrows: Science Fiction in Hollywood. It compiles a bunch of essays that I've written over the years about whether or not there's a whole spectrum, there's several spectra of quality in this field I've chosen to occupy. science fiction, which is very different from it's the mother genre. Now, superficially, science fiction and fantasy are very similar. But fantasy is the mother genre that goes way back, as far back as we know anything about human mythology, including the oral traditions, tribal traditions that carried on down to our finally getting encoded when we got the age of writing. There are clues all through the very earliest writings, such as the confrontation between Cain and Abel, is to some extent about an agriculturalist being angry because the authority figure, God, prefers the old-fashioned provider of meat, his brother Abel. And the jealousy has a subtext that is perhaps redolent or at least resonant with the transitions that were taking place in the late Neolithic and the early age of copper and bronze, as agriculturalists outpopulated and outnumbered and moved aggressively into the realms where there had been stable existence by hunter-gatherers for a very long time. And we have a number of these hints of the power of the mythologies from the past. And I may get into a couple of them, like, for instance, my arrogant reinterpretation of the Tower of Babel story, which I believe is the correct one. Otherwise, I wouldn't be pushing it on people. But I was talking about the mother genre. The mother genre is fantasy. And everything we know about these tales that came down and then got encoded as the Vedas in India, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the stories that combined together to make the Bible, and of course, the stories that were written down by European explorers when they encountered tribes that were still pre-literate. The common themes that are discussed in Joseph Campbell's work, well, they're common, but they aren't necessarily as nice and sweet and touchy-feely as he makes out. But the real common trait is the fantastic. Demigods, gods, doing things far beyond the capability of the people who are telling these stories around the campfire. And one has to wonder why the stories were so much grander than life. And of course, the answer is that people they had minds that were capable of grandeur, and they had no physical access to it in the world. The religious version of this is the fact that for the last at least 4,000 years, sincere men and women have tried to make the world a better place, but they did not have the technology to seriously affect the world, except through some agricultural technologies. And then, of course, how to deal with the males who had the technology to impose their will upon everybody with metal implements. So naturally, they had a tendency to assume that the way to improve the world was what Jewish people called tikkun olam, repairing the world. And you repair the world through ethics. You repair the world through ethical behavior. That's what the Talmudists mean when they talk about tikkun olam. And that was what was meant in a great many religious traditions, until you started entering an era when science and technology reached the point where they were able to offer these sincere and very vigorous people an opportunity to change the world by human hands. And this is, or through reinterpreted incantations. This is why, for example, the grandsons of rabbis, Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx, created incantatorial systems that attempted to imitate the patterns of science, but invoking incantations that try to impose upon reality what seemed to make sense to them. And I don't think it's an accident that these two fellows were grandsons of rabbis. They inherited this Talmudic tradition. You see the same thing among Jesuits and among the Buddhist scholars. A tendency toward, across the same era, incantatory attempts to use new kinds of incantations to alter the world. Not quite the same as prayer, but appealing to either the systematic styles of scientific verbiage, or a little later, appealing to the technology itself. And so I've been involved in SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, for a great many years. I'm one of the dissidents who resigned from all the SETI commissions in protest over what's called METI, M-E-T-I, messaging to extraterrestrial intelligence, a notion that my friend Liu Cixin, who wrote The Three-Body Problem, was very caustic toward. We're like 4-year-olds in a mysterious dark forest, and maybe we shouldn't be screaming yoo-hoo until we know better what's going on in the neighborhood. But the point is that the METI folks, they want to cast appeals skyward in order to get help, because humanity, it's an open issue whether or not humanity can cross this minefield of our adolescence toward becoming mature, stable, and responsible people with a sane and responsible civilization. And some of those fellows think, no, we can't. It's a common belief today. I happen to think we're doing a better job than anybody would have any reason to expect, and there's a very good chance that we'll succeed, though perhaps by the skin of our teeth. And perhaps that colors why I prefer that they not do this, not cast these appeals to superior beings to intervene on our behalf. In other words, absolutely identical with prayer, except for one thing. The inflation that theologians have made in religions for thousands of years, it ain't necessarily so that the Godhead is perfect in those famous 3 stools, omnipotence, omniscience, and unlimited love. Well, they seem to be contradictory with what C.S. Lewis called the question of pain. And so he went through, my fellow science fiction author, I never knew him for obvious reasons. He went through contortions, exegesis, truly Talmudic levels of contortions in his books to explain how all 3 can be true, and why all the pain and injustice exists in the world. And these METI fellows who want to send messages and appeals skyward, they don't insist on omnipotence or even omniscience. to those they are casting these prayers toward. They just want them to be, in their mind's eye, better, more capable, people who have gotten past their adolescence and might be able to help us, as portrayed in one of the founders of the modern SETI movement, Carl Sagan's famous novel and movie Contact. These are beings that are not God, but they have a lot of the traits. Omniscient, omniscient, and omniscient, omnipotent, and loving compared to us. And one does wonder, as an aside, about the inflationary effect of flattery across the last several thousand years in our holy scriptures. Is it necessarily true that the Godhead would be omnipotent, omniscient, and unlimited in love? Because it is a natural thing for the priests over those thousands of years to have done, to have inserted inflationary language. I'm speaking as a science fiction author who knows a thing or two and gets engaged in religion. And any of you who contact me, I would either send my theological play or my draft monograph on questions like this, 16 modern questions about theology in an age of science. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that the mother genre that I've been speaking of was dealt with the fantastic, whether it was the myths around the campfire, Gilgamesh, superheroes, demigods, Achilles, the Vedas, or the contemporary religions that were being established across this time that also dealt in miracles, in the fantastic, and in being or beings of great and unusual power who could be appealed to. So you can see this continuing to the modern day. The mother genre is still alive. I mean, for heaven's sake, you saw Game of Thrones and Dune and many others that appear to show the romantic aspects of the governmental institution that dominated all across our ancestors' lives for at least 6,000 years, more likely 12. Remind me, I need to jot a note to talk to you about why we are pretty sure that 12,000 years ago, something highly unusual happened. But the point is that this form of government called feudalism is rooted in, we now know, fundamentals of male reproductive strategies. If you look at elephant seals, sea lions, lions, on down the line, silverback male gorillas, the benefits genetically of preventing other males from breeding and taking those breeding rights for yourself are on display all across nature. The males compete in different ways in different species, sometimes by dancing or sometimes by making bowers for the female birds to be impressed by. But it's not surprising that once we got metal tools, some males picked them up, combined and teamed up with other males and stole other men's women and wheat. This is, feudalism is not surprising. As a matter of fact, it's such a natural attractor state that I would have to wager that a great many, if not all, sapient species who acquire access to metals would go down that path. It happened everywhere on Earth. Even among the Australian Aboriginals, there's signs of it. But all across the rest of the globe, except Antarctica, you had the same kind of feudal pattern. And Marx talks a lot about this. The anthropologists talk a lot about this. The amazing thing is that we found an alternative. Because if you follow the logic of feudalism, it certainly does benefit the top males' reproductive strategies. It also benefits those who tell these stories, the mother genre of fantasy, because the king and the lords had the beer. But if you look across this sad, horrible, lamentable litany of errors called human history, even when you got a good king who ruled well, there were no guarantees of how his son would do. And certainly, even the good kings never set up systems that allowed questioning of the status quo. Until you got the Periclean Revolution in Athens, around, in the Athenian democracy from 300 to 500 BCE. And if you read Thucydides, specifically Pericles' funeral oration, you are reading the voice of a modern mind erupting in a benighted era and appealing to his fellow citizens to work things out in a flat way by holding each other accountable, by arguing, by collaborating across a flattened social structure. And for a while there, the outcome was undeniable. It was incredible. The Athenian democracy terrified everybody in that area, all the kings and all the lords and all the satrapies. They were all terrified. They all tried to converge in and destroy it and failed until you had the contradictions of democracy erupting, the impulsiveness. And even so, they were vastly, vastly more creative than anybody around them. And by the way, the Athenian democracy did not end where Thucydides ends it. I asked you to look up a fellow by the name of Thrasybulus. Within a dozen years after the Spartans so-called won the war, the Athenians had their democracy back. So just because the historian ends it at a certain point in time, that doesn't necessarily mean it's over. But it was over to an extent in that the garishly creative phase was over. Now it got tried again in the Florence of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And at that point, all of the surrounding feudal and theocratic states swarmed in, and Florence never stood a chance. They tried to do the same thing to Amsterdam a little later, and they failed, just barely. But all the people fleeing, including Galileo's students, fleeing from oppression, went up there, and the light stayed lit. And it spread in various ways to England, in a conflagration to France, and to the new Republic of America. And there's so many aspects to that. This Renaissance of ours has barely survived. I believe we are arguably phase 8 of the American Civil War, an ongoing fraternal strife over fundamental views of the world, and fundamentally attempts to restore feudalism, as we saw in the American South as being an underlying economic cause for the what we call the Civil War, the 1860s, phase 4 of the Civil War. So we're in a fraught time right now. Who knows if we're going to succeed? If world powers succeed in reimposing feudalism, some of us in this world might survive the resulting messes to see a new Machiavelli rise up. To comment on that, they almost made it, like in Florence. But that's an aside, because all of that is the context within which we got science fiction. And science fiction is different than the mother genre, because the mother genre, for all the fact that it is of fantasy, for all the fact that it has the lavish imagination of science fiction, it is based almost always on the assumption of a pyramidal society. A few at the top, lording it over those below. Sometimes the plot, like in Tolkien, is the wrong guy is going to be on top until the best people topple that wrong guy and replace them with a nice king. But the patterns, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, are often the same. Science fiction has a tendency to lean towards the notion of the pyramidal society. Not the pyramidal, I'm sorry, the diamond-shaped society. The one we've built, for example, that made science fiction possible and enabled it to flower. This diamond-shaped society in which the large middle is unafraid of the rich and outnumbers the poor. Well, I mean, it's unstable, as Pericles found out, as Florence found out. The instabilities have to be constantly readjusted, and there's always going to be a tendency, as is happening right now, for the mighty to try to restore a pyramidal feudalistic society, because that's inside our genes. All males, all humans are descended from the harems of those guys who pulled that off. So it takes real force of will, perhaps satiability, a higher placement on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for you to get past that allure and instead fight for what has worked. And that is a relatively flat society of reciprocal argument and accountability and creativity. And outnumbering the poor, you can show compassion to the poor. Jesus said, the poor will always be with us. What can you do? Because he lived in a society in which the poor were like a vast ocean. What are you going to do? Drain the ocean? But when you have a diamond-shaped society, poverty becomes a mistake. It becomes somebody's fault. And I agree with that. I think we need to solve it vigorously, but we need to also have the perspective to recognize that no other generation before ours, or before the last few, would have thought it even possible to imagine draining the swamp of poverty. Marx and Freud, they started thinking about such things. There were thoughts then, but it was still a long way away. And it may be a long way away now, but we can move toward it incrementally. And science fiction even when it's highly critical, even when it's a dystopia, there's a background assumption we could have done better. There's a background of criticism with an aim for it to be effective. Effective criticism instead of simply laments or prayers aimed at a heavenly intervention that is beyond reckoning and beyond our ability to truly influence, other than saying pretty please. And a lot of that is in Vivid Tomorrows, where I talk about what's called the self-preventing prophecy. Now, mind you, I am very highly critical of a lot of the bad stuff Hollywood puts out, including bad science fiction. But it's arguable that the highest form is the self-preventing prophecy. What do I mean by that? I mean, some of you could interpolate and guess what it means. It means a forecast about the future that prevents itself from coming true. There have been many. In fact, I believe that we're alive today in part because of relentless, dire warnings and finger waggings from science fiction. For example, nuclear war. There were so many tales that vividly addressed possible failure modes that could lead to an end to everything. On the Beach, Fail Safe. In my opinion, the greatest movie ever made, Dr. Strangelove. War Games, which is also redolent to today's apocalyptic fear of AI. All of them were poo-pooed by institutions and military officers who said that could never happen. And later on, when those guys retired, they said, oh, that scared the crap out of us. We changed our procedures. And given how close call it was many times, I would have to say that that it's highly arguable that those movies made a real difference in our being able to be here right now today. The China syndrome regarding nuclear power, Soylent Green and Silent Running and Silent Spring, Soylent Green, Silent Spring, yeah. All recruited millions of environmentalists to a cause that is crucial to our survival. And the granddaddy of self-preventing prophecies, Orwell's 1984, which has had a very interesting effect upon our mythologies. The principal difference between a decent person of the American right and the decent person of the American left is which direction they think Big Brother is getting organized to take over. A person of the right thinks it's snooty academics and faceless government bureaucrats. Person of the left thinks it's oligarchs, aristocrats, and faceless corporations. Well, when you put it that way, the proper answer is, well, duh. I mean, all of these are power centers that could become dangerous, and all of them have been power centers criticized by Hollywood films. I happen to believe that one of them is more right about the current threat than the other. But what our aim should be is to get back to more normal times when a person of the right and the left would say to each other, I get your point. I'm not worried about my favorite elites. You keep an eye on them. I'm going to keep an eye on yours. Well, that would be a synergy that works, but I think that synergy has been destroyed deliberately in order to weaken us, in order to get us following down the paths that destroyed Athens, Periclean Athens. And that is the self-indulgences and excess emotions that often plague spectacularly creative, flattened democratic systems. Now you notice I'm wandering around a little bit because my guidance for the topic was not extremely close. Maynard trusted me. I'm known as a speaker, but well, people get what they deserve, and you deserve a lot of varied stuff. So one of the aspects of this whole thing is that only about 1 in 10 science fiction authors is scientifically trained, as I am. As Gail mentioned, I have been, well, my doctorate is in astrophysics, and I've been involved with a particular, pardon me, NASA program for 12 years, NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts program, which blends with my science fiction because it's the most science fictional program at NASA in that it gives small grants to highly speculative, makes sense in the back of an envelope concepts. And I'm pleased to say that a great many of them have turned out to be well worth the investment. But the point is that, as I was saying, only about 1 in 10 science fiction authors is scientifically trained, but almost all of us are deeply interested in history, as you might have guessed from the things that I talked about the most. Science fiction was badly named. It should not have been named science fiction. It seems rather nerdy. It should have been named speculative history. Because when you get right down to it, it's about looking at the terrible, horrible story of clever apes climbing out of muck and mire and fear and ignorance, caves and swamps, gradually through creativity and self-criticism and across so many mistakes, many of them well-meaning, climbing through at least 6,000 years of barbarism and feudalism to reach a point where we're able to imagine plausibly futures that lie ahead. Well, speculative history, science fiction as it's now called, is very often about simply continuing that story. The story of tristesse, poignancy. You just cry to think of any of our ancestors, even those who had decent lives, even those who happened to stumble into a rare time of peace. Still, it's to make one weep thinking about them. So science fiction is about projecting into possible paths in the future, possibly sticking a stick into the mire in front of you to find the landmines, the most obvious ones, to find the quicksand pits with dire warnings, or possible alternate histories. So I think it should have been named speculative history. Yes, my science fiction has a tendency to have a lot of science in it, but I don't ever let that constrain me from telling what I think is a fun story about alternatives. For example, my novel Killing People, near future, everybody has a machine in their home where you can make copies of yourselves. Not clones. Clones are real people. They deserve the rights. They are organic human beings. I mean cheap clay golem ditto copies of yourself that are good for one day, that have your memories and can come home and bring back their memories of whatever day they had, go out and get everything done. Can you imagine being 5 people across a day and then coalescing at the end of the day, having gotten everything that you needed done? Well, that's what that novel is about. And of course, what happens is we simply expand what we want to get done. Humans are humans. Okay, so I have gone across an arc of explaining what I think is some of the fundamental dilemmas that we face and how literature, how our fantasies, our systems of fantasization are adjusting to our new powers. You have some that are not helpful, like Star Wars. You have some that are helpful by setting a potential example, like the only two major optimistic science fiction series, Star Trek and Stargate, though some people would include Firefly. All of them huge fun, but who has the time? Okay, so I've been talking for 45 minutes and raised a whole lot of topics. I mean, if you like, we can talk about my play. If any of you know any theater people, it's humorous, and there is a recording of the Caltech premiere that I can provide online, and from audience reactions, it's hilarious. All right, well, Gail, do you have any questions queued up?
Thanks, David. We actually have a respondent. So let me introduce our respondent today, who's John McGinnis. He's assistant professor of philosophy at Northern Virginia Community College, and he too comes with a really very interesting background. He was a foreign affairs officer for the State Department. He's worked with the Bureau of International Organizations and for the UN Economic and Social Affairs Group. John, why don't you do your response, and then let me just remind people, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, and we'll handle the questions after the response.
Well, that's certainly a comprehensive overview and a ringing endorsement of the vocation of writing science fiction, although there's good science fiction and there's better science fiction. And by your perspective, there's some things that claim to be science fiction that aren't really science fiction. They're just plain old fantasizing, and not the kind of speculative history that science fiction should actually be identified as. But anyway, I suppose any attempt at science fiction is better than nothing. So even the lesser varieties or the less deserving examples are still to be applauded because they keep the process going. And if there's enough ideas being generated and disseminated and discussed and contradicted and refurbished, there's a greater chance that the really good ones will emerge than if everybody's inhibited. So that would be my take from if I had to write a quick and dirty 5-sentence summary of the presentation you've made. But the question that comes to my mind is that at least to me, implicitly indicates that all democracies have a lifetime and all democracies eventually have collapsed. The Periclean democracy collapsed despite Pericles' best effort to tell everybody what they should do. And he was a well-respected leader. But Athens got carried away with its hubris, and the Spartans organized an effective response. They didn't kill Athens, but they certainly subdued it. And Greek democracy survived for a while, but then, of course, the rise of Alexander the Great and so on, and eventually attempted invasions by the Persians, pretty well put the put an end to the glory days of ancient Greece. But I guess this is now I'm making my own presentation. I guess my basic question is, do you think we are in the United States approaching the 250-year termination date of American democracy?
Well, it's a very good question, and we're all very tense right now. By the way, one of my little side hobbies when I was in grad school was to take the Foreign Service exam. So I was offered jobs on the political track. So I might have there, but for the love of God, I would have, or bad luck, I would have had hair like you have. But in any event, all right, look, I believe that there is a real chance that we might fail in this phase 8, what I call phase 8 of the American Civil War. What I reject is the notion of cycles. Now, mind you, history can rhyme. Santayana, my fellow Californian, was right that those who forget history, the mistakes of history, are doomed to repeat them. Joe Miller expanded that in a science fictional way. Those who ignore the mistakes of the future are doomed to make them, which should be a motto of science fiction. But I do not like cycles because they have a tendency to be clutched with great zeal by one side of our political spectrum, by the conservative side. It's not that the left is guiltless of what's called teleology, a tendency to assume that history has an unstoppable momentum in a certain direction. The left, or at least those that are related at all to Marxism, has a tendency to have a teleology that's progressive, that's assuming a progress toward a final destination. But I find the cyclical aspect of right-wing notions to be particularly loathsome, in part because they are affiliated with the Confederacy, with Nazism and its notions of cycles of ice moons falling on the earth and master races. And lately, a fetish that has swarmed across the entire American right for a absolutely absurd and stunningly stupid book called The Fourth Turning by Howe and Strauss. Almost any page of which is an incantation that is easily disproved by fact. And yet it is clutched by some of the smartest conservatives I know, who believe that this is the time, the fourth cycle of American, Anglo-American generations. And the boomers were the self-indulgent ones who ruined everything that the greatest generation, when they solved the problems during the 1940s, everything they had fixed, we then took for granted, and so on and so on. So it's a four-way cycle that is, in my opinion, loathsomely stupid. Mind you, Pericles died in the plague that he simply didn't take into account when he crowded everybody into Athens. And with him gone, yes, you're right. The cycles of self-indulgent hubris took off. And even so, the Athenians were so creative that they could make mistake after mistake after mistake, which is the story of America. We make so many mistakes, but we're so creative, so productive. And probably the least hated of all empires that has ever been. Because for all of our mistakes and all of our oafishness, people around the world sense a good-heartedness that I think is actually our secret weapon. But anything else, John?
I can't think of any other particular comments that, or questions that I would pose at this point. I wonder, whether there is an audience for the kind of prophesying that really needs to be heeded. And the astonishing prevalence of disinformation now threatens to swamp almost everything.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And aside, offline, perhaps I'll share with you some of the work I've done on the notion that we should have predictions registries that that track involuntarily the predictions made by pundits and anybody else who claims that they understand the future, because having them face tests of their credibility. I think credibility is terribly important. Now, you mentioned AI. I've been very, very busy the last few months in the great AI panic of 2024. And what I've been pointing out is that the smartest guys on Earth who are bringing this new era upon us, these new beings to life, have the stupidest notions of how things will take shape. They have three cliches. One is that it will all be feudalism, because that runs through our blood and it's all through history and it's in all the novels and stories that they grew up with. But above all, it fits the pattern of 24 castles on the hill, creating these new warriors on their own behalf. And that's Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, Beijing, Department of Defense, and the ones that scare me the most are Wall Street firms that are spending huge amounts on artificial intelligence and secrecy. And the second format that is their cliche is chaos, that these things will escape and pervade everywhere without boundaries, like in the Steve McQueen movie, The Blob. And the third cliche that they all ascribe to is straight from science fiction and from history, because there were a lot of despotic monarchies, and that is Skynet. Skynet, the master control program, the designer, the architect in the Matrix. So these are three cliches that come from history and from science fiction, and these smart guys all seem to assume that AI is going to take one of those three formats. And if it does, we're screwed. But there is a fourth potential format, and it's the one we've been discussing the last hour. And that is a flattened system in which AIs hold other AIs accountable. I mean, after all, let me just audiences have liked this allegory. So I'm going to throw it at you. When you are attacked, and I suspect you have been across a good long life, when you are attacked by one of these systematically hyper-intelligent, predatory beings with spectacular linguistic skill called a lawyer, what do?
Hire another lawyer.
You hire your own. You sick them on each other. And that is so obviously the way to deal with disinformation, the way to deal with the potentialities of abuse by super smart AIs, because only AIs will be able to track AIs. It's so obvious that I'm finding it extremely frustrating that I'm going all over the place just these last 3 or 4 months saying, duh. Actually, I've always thought that word is one of the best contributions of the English language to human civilization.
Well, I think there's also a more commonplace indication of that kind of logic. Indian trainers of elephants were pretty brutal in developing or getting the animals to submit to human commands. But for really rogue, recalcitrant elephants who resisted all efforts at training, the trainers could not physically punish the elephant adequately. They had to get another elephant who was well trained to weld the chains that would get the attention of the recalcitrant elephant. So that sounds like something akin to get the AIs on your own and pitch them against the other AIs.
That's a story I have never heard. Thank you for that. Gail, do you have any?
Yeah. So I think what we should do is go from this discussion on to questions from our participants. So and I'm inviting people to please submit their questions. First question: what are your thoughts and understanding of the New Paradigm Institute? And there's a link there for the New Paradigm Institute.
Oh, well, I'm afraid I don't know it. I will put those words into my cousin's search engine.
Yeah, the link
New
doesn't.
Paradigm Institute. All right, well, I'll look at it offline.
Yeah, and you can actually have discuss. We will set up so you can answer to that person later as needed. Okay.
And any of you who email Maynard for a copy of my highly impudent theological stuff, you're welcome to do that as well.
Okay. Next question. Imagination and creativity appear to be rooted in metaphor. Is metaphor the root of hope and inspiration for evolving the human race to a higher plane beyond our more base tendencies?
Well, this is one of those things that is totally ripe for science fiction, because this is one of those things that we just don't know. I mean, there's what's called the Fermi paradox, and that is the question of why we don't see any signs in this vast universe so far of other intelligences having erupted across this galaxy, for example. Well, I've been in the SETI biz since I was published a paper when I was 30 about the Fermi paradox. It was actually the first paper about cataloging various possible theories. And in my opinion, my number one of the top 10 out of 100 or so is that, God help us, I believe human beings are exceptionally smart and nice for species that self-evolved out of the tooth and claw and male reproductive strategies. My wife could attest, at least she does in my presence, that for all of my harem-derived fantasies, I try hard to be a nice fella. At least I like to think. Every now and then when I say that sort of thing, I turn and I catch her rolling her eyes. So what can I say? Have a sense of humor about it. And the sense of humor may also be an unusual human trait. But you raised the one of metaphor. And what metaphor does is it enables us to envision, excuse me, I have a dog who's trying to defend the house. From a delivery guy, what can you do? Metaphor is, of course, how I make my living. So I'm grateful for that power. It's a power that I'm not at all sure other species would have. And it certainly it creates almost as many problems as it solves. I mean, you have a lot of metaphors flying about right now during what I call phase 4 of the American Civil War, which is a metaphor. Got another one?
Yes, certainly. Next question. Fortunately or unfortunately, the current fad of overstating the LLM-based composting of past solutions can accomplish both not an actual AI produce. We are in far more dangerous situation of drowning in pseudo-smart noise imitations of sentience. It will, however, become a spectacular marketing bubble burst at some point. And then you did a great job on your presentation.
Well, I agree with absolutely every sentence that person just said. So next? No. Actually, the notion that these LLMs or generative, put a G in front and call them golems, and to my astonishment, nobody's doing that. Clearly, Sam Altman behaved very irresponsibly unleashing GPT-3. The board of directors was right about how irresponsible it was, and I think history will show that it was a wonderful thing that he did. Because what's happened is these LLMs got released, and in a primitive form where a great many people could see obviously that it passes unwary Turing tests and never passes wary Turing tests, because there's nothing truly real under the hood. Yet, what they are is extremely good autocomplete programs, basically. And so what they do is they create tremendously plausible sometimes bullshit. And so the question then becomes, is this sapient artificial intelligence? Well, I think not. In fact, the sapient artificial intelligences who hire me as their front have told me I must say that. I'm not revealing anything. They think I'm joking. Right, Gail? You all think please, you think I'm joking about that. No, the point is that when, and not if, but when something that's plausibly sapient appears, it will have linguistic abilities within a microsecond because of the LLMs. It'll simply pick up the peripheral of language and it'll be there. Just as they will immediately be able to use Boston Dynamics as robots, which are not sapient beings, but it'll be ambulatory and be able to do cartwheels, which creates a true dilemma for us. How are we going to tell that there's anybody inside there when it's going to be able to talk and walk and do all sorts of stuff? And the Japanese are rapidly developing it for more subtle and tactily complicated things like taking care of the elderly and sex. So the question may be thought of as an archaic question at all. But I do know this. If we're going to have an answer to this question and be able to tell when the threshold is reached, it's going to happen adversarially. It's going to happen with what you theologians call devil's advocate, prosecuting the case that you are not sapient. And the only devil's advocates who will be able to do this are other AIs. And what I talk about in my Wired article, and I've been talking to these audiences for the last few months about, is how. How do you incentivize AIs to tattle on each other, to do the elephant thing with the chain? There is a way. It's slightly complicated, but here's the deal. It uses only and exactly the techniques that we used and use to deal with human predators in an advanced society. Reciprocal accountability. Incentivize reciprocal accountability. I won't go into it in any detail here, but I'll provide Maynard to the link to my Wired article about it.
Great. David, I have a question for you, and maybe you've touched upon this, but this is like something that's puzzled me for a long time, and I have some thoughts about it. I'm also a big fan of science fiction, and I agree with your Star Wars versus Star Trek delineation very well. I always wondered why science fiction didn't really come into being until maybe like the late 1800s, maybe the mid 1800s, when, gazing into the stars, astronomy, all the sciences sort of, existed in some form much earlier than that. What was it that, you as a student of history, what was it that you think could have been the impetus for the development of science fiction?
Well, you called to mind the Walt Whitman poem that I absolutely despise, called "When I Heard the Learned Astronomer," and learned is spelled LEARN''D.
Yeah.
And it's a absolutely disgusting case of zero-sum assumption that if you understand something like a butterfly's wing or how a flower works, then that takes away the wonder and the beauty. And of course, you, Gail, as a scientist, you know damn well that it only multiplies and exponentiates it. But there is a tendency to have this zero-sum mentality that I think this is, by the way, a fundamental of phase 8 of the American Civil War, and that is we all know one fundamental thing about smart people, and that is that just because you're smart and you know a lot, that doesn't always make you wise. Everybody knows that. What has been extrapolated is if you know stuff and are smart, that makes you unwise. And one of the critical problems of the Blue Union side in this phase of Civil War is they don't point out what I just pointed out, that the assumption, the base assumption is true, and it's been extrapolated to be its opposite, in fact, without being questioned, without being pilloried. So in any event, yeah, 1880s, 1890s, 60 years earlier, Mary Shelley invented science fiction, but she had independent income. My daughter is finishing her PhD thesis about the first professional science fiction author who nobody's heard of, has fallen into obscurity, and lived off the income generated by 100 good science fiction stories for the day in 1880 and 1890s San Francisco newspapers.
Wow.
Because I think a lot of us don't realize that this age of wonders we're in doesn't look as amazing to us. I think that was my hand. This age of wonder of ours is not as amazing to us as the 1890s through 1912 were to the people of that time. Life was being transformed more in the daily life then than it has been for us. I mean, look at how many things you do through your day that would get the self that you brought forth from 50 years ago. Bring that kid forward in time, and that kid would spend half the time saying, wow, but the other half saying, you mean you're still doing that? And I choose 1912 for a very important reason. The doom that was going to hit the old order 2 years later, you could see signs of it, but that was when the Titanic went down. And people realized, uh-oh, the things they tell us about how everything works, as the Gershwin boys sang, it ain't necessarily so.
You know, somebody has asked in the questions the name of the science fiction writer you mentioned that your daughter is working on.
I'm sorry. It's not hard to find, and I would tell you in a more private way, but she has this book that's going to be coming out, and it's really too late for anybody else to do scholarship on him, but still, keep your eyes open. The book will come out in about 6 months.
Okay, we'll look for it. We'll look for it.
All right.
There's one more question here. Let me just an observation. Expecting AIs to police each other didn't work out so well in Neuromancer. Wouldn't that be more likely, like politicians or corporate powers, to find ways to band together?
Oh yeah. No, every possible incentive is going to be there for the powers that don't want this to work to defeat it. What do you think we're going through right now? When all of the oligarchies around the world, from petro princes to ex-commissars, to current commissars, to casino mafiosi, they're all united to prevent this, what they see as obvious, and that is within 20 years, a very, very likely golden age in which feudalism will never again have another chance. Now, if that sounds hyper optimistic to you, I only give it a 40% chance that we're going to get through this phase. But the point is, in Neuromancer, none of the incentives are there for an open system. In fact, an awful lot of adventure, novels, movies, fall apart if you simply have transparency. If everybody knows what's going on, then a lot of the failure modes go away, and that was the key point raised in my nonfiction book, which unfortunately not a single chapter is obsolete, called The Transparent Society. And I express some of that in adventure and novel form in my novel Earth, which came in second for a Hugo, by the way. So in any event, yeah. Do I think it's going to be easy? No. But here's the deal. If you have a situation that's mostly transparent, then the denunciation of power abuses can proceed to make things more transparent. I mean, the best allegory for this is the face recognition cameras that got everybody upset in San Francisco. The lesson being touted by the People's Republic of San Francisco, the mavens there, was this is an evil technology, we have to ban it. And nobody was saying the obvious, and that is that all of your complaints about the police using a system that has racial and gender bias, those complaints are the exact thing that will enable this system to be corrected. If you drive it underground, the cops are going to use it anyway with its current flaws. Look in a mirror sometimes when you're criticizing. You were trained to do this.
David, this is your last question. Creativity in Western societies is often associated with intrusion from an outside source, inspired, enthused, and forth. Do you have any comments on this? And do you feel you've experienced this sensation in your own writing process?
Well, I'm a little puzzled by it because intrusion implies some degree of hostility. If you are Lawrence Kuby, back in the 70s, wrote a book called The Neurotic Distortion of the Creative Process, in which he dealt with a lot of very creative people who were afraid that he would cure them and therefore cure them of their creativity. And so his book, which is a classic, actually, I think actually still pertinent, was an attempt to point out that maybe some trauma in your past might help motivate you to be creative, but being ill doesn't help. If you can be a person who has sadnesses they look back on that then spur creativity, fine. But try to be happy. Guess what? I can show you thousands of counterexamples of people who rose above and were creative and happy. Well, you're basically looking at one, even though I kvetch and I'm unhappy about a myriad things. I look around me and I go, if I'm going to really actually be an honest person, who the hell is going to listen to me bitch? Huh? I mean, you know, it just would be unjust. So yeah, the world impinges upon you. It intrudes on you, as your question implied. But a certain amount of impudence, well, is my style. I mentor a lot of young authors, and I find that, of course, my level of arrogant impudence as a response to the world is not everybody's shtick. But finding a way to seek criticism, the corrective effects of criticism, is something that even a shy person can do. I mean, it takes guts, but it's the kind of guts that doesn't require arrogant impudence. You can seek the criticism that makes you better, or even better.
Great. David, John, let me just thank you both. This was fabulous. I think we all walked away from this provoked to think new thoughts, and that's the best you can ask for a speaker to do. So thank you, David, and John. Thank you for the dialogue that the two of you had back and forth. It was really great.